this day whom you will serve.
For this milestone, we have 3 core competencies for this particular milestone. So you have those there in front of you, and they are knowing your design as male or female. Like understanding how has God put you together? What does that mean to be male and to be female? Number 2 is leveraging an environment of honest conversations on all subjects. And obviously, when we're talking commitment to purity, you need to create a safe environment on all subjects because you're going to need to be able to discuss this one, right? So if you haven't created that environment, then to jump into conversation on sex, sexuality, like that's going to be very, very awkward, very uncomfortable. And it's going to be awkward and uncomfortable anyway. But if you haven't created an environment where, hey, we dialogue together, you can ask me questions, we can talk. Again, remember, developmental stage. So they're moving from concrete to abstract thinkers. They're thinking about values. They need you to be increasing your explanation of things. So if your parenting style hasn't changed from when they were 2, it needs to start adjusting to where you're communicating more. And maybe you've seen this before where a parent is giving like a very lengthy lecture on the reasons why, this child should stop their temper tantrum, and the child's 3. You're like, nope. Like that's not going to work. Like they're not developmentally going to be able to, rationalize this decision. And so a lot of times we get that backwards. We talk way too much when they're younger and not enough when they're older. And then we just are pulling the authority card of, well, just do it because I said so. Which again, that foundation needs to be there. I'm not opposed to that. There's times that you need to say that, but there's also times where you need to say, all right, let's sit down and let's have a conversation. So that's a very important dynamic to create within the relationship with your child, to be able to have honest conversations on all subjects so that you can have multiple conversations in regards to sex and sexuality. It's not going to be the talk, right? I mean, there'll be times maybe where you're sharing more information and you're having something that would feel like a significant talk, but that won't be the last one. You'll have to have more of those. And then the third core competency is establishing a pattern of your child growing in God's design for both maturity and responsibility, and independence and privilege. So let me just give a little bit of kind of a biblical precedent for that. That's a mouthful, and we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about that theme. But if you remember this story, I love this story. We get like very few stories about Jesus when he was the age of our children, when he was, at this stage of his development. But we do get one. We get one story of Jesus, age 12, going to the temple with his parents. It's a really big deal. And then what Jesus does is he actually leaves his parents' supervision, right, and stays stays in Jerusalem, right? So he's run away from his mom and dad.
At that point?
Great question. I would say no, he has not, and we'll see why in the story. But so Jesus stays behind at the temple, and he's having conversations with the religious leaders, and Mary and Joseph, like they leave, and they realize Jesus is not with them. And they're like, hey, Mary, I thought he was with you. I thought he was with you. I thought he was with, Uncle Melchizedek or whatever. But so they realize Jesus is not with them, so they go back. And do you remember what Jesus says to them when they find him? Do you remember the line?
Doing my Father's.
Yeah, he said, didn't you know I needed to be about my Father's business? Now, what's happening with Jesus? What's happening with Jesus is he's growing towards maturity and independence. Right? He's moving outside of the directive leadership of Mary and Joseph, because he's growing into his identity of being the son of God and That comes with some responsibilities. But that in and of itself is kind of a wow. Like Jesus had to grow into that. He was learning, and that's kind of vision for us, that our children would grow and mature. And Luke 2 verse 52, I have the verse there. It says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature, in favor with God and man." So Jesus matured. Jesus grew up, and he grew in wisdom and in stature. And then there was a social dynamic, right? It was in favor, obviously, with God, but also with man. Like, he started to be esteemed, and that's what Jesus was growing up. Jesus was growing up into. But the thing that stuns me about this story is Jesus is kind of moving into that. But the end of the story says that he went back and submitted himself again to Mary and Joseph back in Nazareth. Right? So Jesus wasn't that's not the launch of his ministry at age 12. That was just him starting to grow into this independence and maturity. But yet he still went back and submitted himself to the leadership of Mary and Joseph, as he then continued to increase in wisdom and in stature, in favor with God and with man. So that picture, it really gives me a picture of what I'm looking for at this stage of development with our children. Is we're learning to move them towards independence, towards maturity, and we want to lead them. We want to lead them that way. I also hope that it raises our expectations. Right? Like, Jesus was able to increase in wisdom and in stature through his teenage years. It wasn't, we sure hope, he doesn't go to prison. There was an opportunity for him to mature and to grow. And I think a lot of times our problem is we have low expectations for our children. And I think we need to reject the notion of what our culture says about what our children should be as teenage years, this prolonged adolescence that pushes up into mid to late 20s, right? Still living as if, in the early teenage years, and not having that sense of responsibility. So we want to raise the standard of where we're going with our children. I would just say your children can do hard and important things, right? Like, your children have the capacity to meaningfully contribute to your household, to the lives of other people, to their community. Like, they have the capacity to do that. So my desire for us is not to survive, but to thrive through, like that little rhyme, but to do that through our teenage years. And in order to do that, we have to change the culture of our home and start establishing some new patterns where we see our children going in God's design for maturity and responsibility and independence and privilege. So how do we do that? I'm going to give you 3 ways that I think we can change that culture of our home to establish that kind of training, that sort of training environment. All right. So the first one is have vision, cast vision. Have vision for your kids. What do you? We're still on the first page there. Have vision, cast vision. So what is it that you want your kids to be? Right? What is it that you want them? What kind of character do you want them to have? So have some vision for them, and then cast that vision. And the way that you cast vision is you tell stories. Like, we talk about faith talks, God sightings. Like, what are the things you celebrate around the table? What are the movies you watch and the heroes that you put in front of your kids? Like, have those kinds of conversations. Strategically leverage their entertainment so that they're getting to see the kinds of people you want them to be, and have conversations about that. So as you have your faith talks, talk about different characters in the Bible that you want your child to grow into, or to have a model for them. The other thing I would say to help develop this kind of environment where we're training our children is I highly recommend that you lead them to master something. Master something, master anything. Right? Whether it's being an excellent writer, or really good at the piano, or amazing at archery, or like I don't think it matters as much what it is you're leading them to master, but to master something requires hours of discipline. And that skill to master something is something they'll be able to transfer into other areas of life. So you can find something that you think is valuable, that's of interest to them, and like have them work at it, right? In whatever that will be. Hebrews 12:11, for the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Right? So in mastering something, it's not going to feel good. Like whatever it is, maybe they're interested in it, but it's going to come to the point where it becomes hard work. Right? And so that discipline is required for them to be trained by it. I'm sure you've heard this verse before, train up a child in the way he should go, and what?
When he's old, will not depart from it.
Right, and we really latch on to that, when he's old, he won't depart from it. But what we miss is the train up a child part. Like the training environment. Like training is not, I just tell you something and you do it. Like training is like a series of events where you are being called to do something, you're being challenged, you're being corrected, right? Like if you've ever trained for something, that's not a moment, right? It's 1,000 moments that go into your training and your development. So lovingly, then my third point here is lovingly lead a process instead of impatiently demanding a performance. And that's the thing I really want to focus in on here is how we lovingly lead a process. So I used a couple of key phrases here, and I want to try and put them together, and hopefully I can do that quickly in a way that is clear for you, because this kind of it becomes a grid by which you can make decisions, right? Like I used to have this book from James Dobson. It was this big, thick book, and it was basically like you create a parenting scenario, you look it up, and he tells you what to do, right? Which I was very frustrated by that book because his scenarios never fit my scenarios, and when he would tell me what to do, I didn't know why I was doing the thing he was telling me I should be doing. What I'm looking to create here is a dynamic that you can apply into any situation, okay? So the first thing we want to do is we want to move our children from privilege to independence. All right, we want to grow them from privilege to independence. So what I mean by that is privilege is these are the gifts that you would give them. Right, and so let me, and I'm not talking like Christmas presents. I'm talking about where you give them a privilege. So here's a list of privileges. They get to pick what they eat. That's a privilege. Choosing what they eat. There's a time in their life where they cannot have that privilege. They're too immature for it. I remember one time I went to my mom's house and she had my kids for dinner. And she made like 7 different meals. So as soon as she'd put one down, they didn't want that one anymore. They wanted something else. And she would make another one. Then they want another one. Like they were too immature to have that privilege. They should have eaten whatever she made. So that's a privilege. Choosing what they wear, that's a privilege. Screen time in any form, that's a privilege, not a right. Extracurricular activities, those are privileges. I like to think of their schoolwork, that's their job. Right? They have to do that one. That's not a privilege. That's a responsibility. Like, got to do that one. We're not going to take that one away. But all the other extracurricular activities, which for us, that includes dance, soccer, choir, youth group. There's times where that's not an appropriate step for them. That needs to be taken away, even though that, those are things that I want for them. But time with friends, time alone. That's also a privilege to be able to just have some me time, some downtime. Where they sit at the table, where they sit in the car. Like those are privileges. Those aren't rights. Okay? What are not privileges is food. Food is not a privilege. That's a kind of foundational obligation, need. Love is not a privilege. That is a responsibility of a parent. Their education, right? From a parenting standpoint, like that's part of your job, so you don't leverage those things. But privileges are not their rights; they're their privileges, and that becomes important because the next thing you see in Figure 2 is responsibility that leads to maturity. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say a big point. So on the privilege point, it moves from privilege, right? So privilege to independence. That's where we're going. Right? So right now, so the best privilege we can give is when we trust that the values, the decision making has been passed on so they can move with complete independence. So then the other one that we leverage this way is, that's a crazy arrow, is responsibility to maturity. So we use responsibility, that's Figure 2, the top of the second page, responsibility to maturity. So responsibilities, what kind of responsibilities do your children have? Like what are you asking of them to do? So certain responsibilities could be making the bed, cleaning out the litter, clean out their room, take out the trash. And then as they mature, to be able to do that without reminder. Right? To do that like independently. They're able to, oh, that's my responsibility. Okay, I handle that. Help neighbors. Right? Like that should be something we want to train. Like that's a responsibility. We're part of a community of people. So that's what we do, and that's what we do in our family. So the goal is to move them from responsibility towards maturity, where they're making those good decisions, accepting responsibility on their own, and they're mature. They're mature in that. And so I want to just emphasize in the responsibility towards maturity, it's not just behavior. It's also you're passing on the values that are behind those behaviors. So maybe it starts with, I want you to go help, Wayne across the street shovel his driveway. Well, that's not because their heart is just overflowing with joy and love for the community they live in. It's because I told them to walk out there and do it. That's okay. But over time, what you want is to be able to unpack what's the value. And so maturity would be they've got the value coupled with, the expression of that value in behavior. So how do you teach them these values? Right? So how do you teach them how to move towards maturity? So the way you do that is figure 3. Right? Figure 3 is you leverage privilege with responsibility. Right? So when you see that they're acting responsibly, then they get privilege. And when they're not acting responsibly, guess what? They don't get privilege. So I get this from, this is all over Scripture. Read the book of Proverbs. Like it's just the general pattern of, Hebrews says that we must believe that God exists and that He what? That He's a rewarder of those who seek Him. Right? So there's blessing in obedience. Or Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Responsibility, obedience. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. That's your responsibility. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you. That's privilege. That's blessing. That it's going well with you. And that you'll live long in the land. So I think this is the way God has set things up for us, is that we leverage the growing responsibility and maturity to give them increasing privileges towards independence. Is that making sense?
Yes.
So what you see then is in figure 4, then the line going this way, you see the line going this direction, that represents your child's maturity. That's your child's maturity and independence. Because our goal is at some point, right? Like we're not directive in our leadership for them. Right? So as our child grows and matures, all the way down here, right? Like at the beginning, they can do nothing on their own. They are entirely dependent. right? If they want food, you have to feed them. Left to themselves, they will not survive. They're entirely dependent on you, right? But as they grow in responsibility, then they can increase towards their independence. So the last figure to round this out is figure 5, where I drew this line. Right? And so what this circle represents is parents' leadership style changing. So here it's very directive. But as the child grows in maturity and so therefore independence, it moves from directive to influencing. Right? So like for my 17-year-old, like for the most part, I'm not very directive in my leadership. There's times when I need to be, but it's more of I'm training her to be a good independent decision maker. So I'm at a point where I turn a lot of that over to her, and I'm at a point of influence in her life. There are times where I have to confront her, and then I need to be more directive because she's not demonstrating the maturity, that she needs to move at certain levels of independence. All right. I want to pause there for some questions on this. Because this was the kind of the big thing I wanted us to get is this dynamic of moving from privilege to independence, from responsibility to maturity, and how what our job is to leverage those two things. And so we give privileges based on demonstrated responsibility, and then we take away privileges based on a failed demonstration of responsibility. I honestly, the examples for this are for me. So, my son didn't go to youth group this past week because failed responsibility. So he made some really bad decisions regarding some of his schoolwork, and I said, I'm sorry, buddy, so Wednesday night, he doesn't go. And he has to go do what he was supposed to do before. I hated that because I love the influence of youth group. It's a real gift that I learned in his life. But I wasn't able to, in good conscience, send him. So I needed to leverage those things. Yeah, Larissa.
How do you, you've had many kids at different, as the stage is, it's kind of moving through, and by the time it gets maybe to your youngest, you'll feel like this is a little bit easier to navigate, right? But how do you work with kids who are that 11, 12 stage in a practical way? And you can use an example or whatever, but arguing, complaining, doing a job completely. Those, that's what we talk about when they're really young. But when those things are not accomplished in a given task and the arguing and complaining continues, how does that fit into this spectrum of growing maturity, privilege, responsibility when you're given a task and it's so difficult as a parent to get through? This is not one of those things we are to discuss. How do you kind of...
So are you saying they're not doing what you ask, or they're doing it with a bad attitude? They're doing it after you argue your way through it?
Well, first it starts off with arguing, complaining, not wanting to do it. Then it's, this is not something we're going to discuss. This is something that is on your to-do list, and you will do it because I've asked you to. Okay, well, now they start doing it, but it's with arguing and complaining, and the mouth continues.
So here's what I would say, and I'll try and answer it simply, is repeat and keep having him do it until you get success. So I just went through this with my 15-year-old. They did it, but they did it with a crappy attitude, punishing the rest of the family. But yes, it got done. I said, well, that's not good enough. You're going to have to do it again until we get it where we don't get the complaining, we don't get the arguing, So that's not demonstrated responsibility, right, or demonstrated maturity if it's coming with a battle in order for you to do your responsibilities, right? So therefore, the privilege is leveraged, and a lot of times it's do it again. Like you have to do that job again.
And to clarify, you mean do it again right away, not do it again
Another time.
Another time. You're saying right now.
Not
Yes.
do it later. Do
Yes,
it
it's
again.
not like, I don't know, it wasn't take out the trash, but yeah, you're going to have to take out the trash next week too. It would be,
Right now.
you're going to have to get up, you're going to have to address that now, and you're going to have to do it again in the future. Yeah. So I would just stay with it because that's your standard of maturity, right? So whatever the privilege is, until you get that standard of maturity, then don't be satisfied. So attitude, like, that again goes back to do everything right away, all the way without complaining.
Yes.
Right? Like that's still true.
The first parenting conference I came
That's
to
right.
here. Thank
Yes.
goodness.
So that doesn't change. And so if we're not getting that, like you may have gotten it done, but that's not mature. And I mean that really bothers my children when I say you're really acting like 5-6-year-old. Like that's what I'm getting from you right now. So therefore I have to dial down the privileges that are appropriate for a 5-6-year-old. Right? So being able to have a phone, a 5-6-year-old doesn't have a phone. They don't get to call people, text people. No, they don't do that. So sorry, like that's gotta come because that's what I'm getting from you.
Thank you.
Oh, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So, one of the privileges would be extracurricular activities like sports. My girls
Yeah.
do a lot of sports, and I do struggle with this, like taking that away because
Yeah.
I feel like then it affects the team.
Yeah,
like-
yeah, that's a tough one.
So, would you say like then, because I've had Maddie like go to her coach and say, I wasn't able to be at practice because I was disrespectful to my mom or
Wow.
whatever. She hates it. She's gonna
Sure.
hate this one.
I would
Do it
hate
again.
that.
I'm like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's gonna start with that.
Yeah.
So, but do you think? I mean, it's hard. It's hard.
So
because
play that out, right? So if that means the coach says, "Well, I'm sorry if you don't come to practice,
Right. You
then you
sit the
can't.
bench."
You sit the bench." Well, that's just a further consequence
Okay.
of her sin against you. Or if you can't play in the games, then you're not going to be on the team. That's a further consequence of why this is so important.
Okay. So then just look at it like in that perspective.
Yeah. And I mean that's true in life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you could lose your job
Lose your job.
over other
Yep.
decisions that you make and in other places, and so.
Okay.
All right, let me hit a couple of other points here. So with these milestones, there's an appropriate sense of celebration that we want to do as we lead in these things. So I've done a couple of different things with my kids for that. Probably the biggest one related to the issue of purity, which I didn't pick that, the issue of sexuality a lot, but this dynamic is how we walk that through. But one of the things that I did was my wife did with Isabella. It was called 8 Great Dates. That's in your resource list, which I'll give you, which was a series of, they would go out, listen to a recording that talked about God's design for femininity and have a series of conversations. I did with my boys. I'll do it this year with Law, who's going to be turning 13 in a couple months. We'll go away for a weekend and we'll do the Passport to Purity, which is similar in the sense of it's an audio teaching and a number of different exercises for us to have a conversation. But one of the things that Angie and I both felt very strongly with this issue about sex and sexuality is we didn't want to dive in too quickly into all the different aspects of deviant sexual behavior before our kids even knew where do babies come from, right? So we wanted to spread this conversation out over a series of years in order to create a safe place. So if things came in that they could talk to us about, but we would keep an eye on when do we need to have this conversation? When are these questions coming up? And I feel pretty good about with all 3 of our older ones. We've had those conversations with. But we start out with just let's talk about the biology of things, and just being very practical, very anatomically correct. So just kind of talking that through. But then at this Passport to Purity weekend, I will broach some subjects related to deviant sexual behavior, but that's at age 13, not at age 7, 8, or 9. Now that's just kind of the way that we did it. I know that there's other times, unfortunately, because of different situations, that you don't get the privilege of that kind of timeline. But so what I would recommend, again, you create the safe place. But even if they've been introduced to some things earlier, I think there should be some very significant times where you have some honest conversations. And like I remember with Jude when we were doing the Passport to Purity one, we were going to go away. He knew we were going to go away. He kind of knew we were going to talk through things about him becoming a man and sex and sexuality. And so things would come up. He'd be like, we'll talk about that at the weekend away, right, Dad? Those sorts of things. So, that was a fantastic time, for the two of us, and I haven't figured out how I'm going to do that with Law yet, but we'll be doing that later on this year, and we'll get away, just the two of us, probably some sort of adventure, but also creating space for us to have some significant time to talk. I celebrate that by the weekend itself. There's a great memory for us, or for Angie and Isabella, the dates that they went on together. Also, I gave a gift to, something that, would be nice for him. I think Nate gave like a chain to his boys. I'm not sure if that's cool anymore, if you can do that, or a ring or a bracelet, or I don't know. You could do something to kind of mark this transition of kind of like, once you ring that bell, you can't unring it. So they've kind of entered into this world of sex and sexuality in terms of understanding and knowing what sexual purity means, and how to guard that as they become the woman God has intended, or the man that God has intended. So I would definitely recommend marking out that milestone. Before you guys leave, it's 11:26, so we have some time. Before you guys leave, this is a resource list I'm going to send around. You'll see this says Preparing for Adolescence on the top, Milestone 4. What I did was I just added to that one, because a lot of these same books that we had put on when we did that one are similar. So if you're going to Nate's session on Preparing for Adolescence, you'll find a similar, if not the exact same. But I would recommend, let me highlight a couple of things down here. You see the 8 great dates are number 3 under Book for Parents to walk through their pre-adolescent with. Also, Passport to Purity is number 8. Those are the two that Angie and I have used. I'm not sure if we'll use 8 Great Dates again with Lorelei, if Angie liked that much. I am definitely using Passport to Purity again with Law. I'll be doing that this year. We got some time with Lorelei, so we'll see.
Is that more geared toward boys?
Passport to Purity? No.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
It's not. It's not. I just used that with boys because I was the one doing it.
Okay.
But
that was
no,
a book you liked.
It was a book I felt comfortable with the model, like the weekend away. Angie felt more comfortable with the let's do a series of dates together. So whatever works. But the 8 Great Dates is specifically for girls, moms with girls. Passport to Purity is not.
Okay.
There's some audio lessons in there that are, if it's boy or if it's girl, like you play a different one. Another book that I highly recommend is under books for pre-adolescents is Do Hard Things. That was a book we read as a family. I just think it's a great book. It's about raising the standard. And then Farmer Boy is a fictional book that if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend you reading it with your kids. But it's really just about a life on a farm and a boy growing up on a farm, and just getting to see him take those developmental stages and steps towards becoming a man and growing in his responsibility. But it really gave some good vision for that. So those are some tools and resources for you. So let me again just pause there. What are some other questions that you guys would have. Just so you know, I'm pretty sure the way lunch is set up is that you could grab your lunch and come back up here if you want to do that. So we could keep talking if you'd like to. So actually, why don't we do this? Why don't I pray, and then if you want to grab your lunch and come back up, just let me know, and I'll make sure I stay here. If you don't want to continue talking about this, that's fine. You can go, eat your lunch. Yeah.
Who's the author of Farmer Boy? Is it Laura? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, nothing else. Make sure.
Yep. Oh, and before I forget, I meant to do this earlier. If you have any questions that you didn't want to bring up, and would like to possibly get an answer to, please write that down on this sheet before you go, because we will be having Q&As in the future, and so it'd be very helpful to have some questions that are kind of burning questions for you guys for those, okay? So I'll put a stack down here, and then a stack down there if you'd be willing to. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for truth. Thank you for your word. I thank you, Jesus, for the model that you grew into maturity. And I thank you that we have the privilege of leading our children towards being mature, independent decision makers. And so leading them through the issues of sex and sexuality is a significant part of that. And so I pray, God, that you would help us over 2018 to create the kind of environment where we can talk about these issues with our children and be present with them as they face overt challenges, subtle challenges to what you have designed them to be. So thank you, Jesus.
Show me the meaning of faithfulness in a world that knows not.